And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And of course, you can still go back to our original website on Coalition 1.0 as on the radio, and 2.0 at Go Local Prov, and at coalitionradio.us. Anyone who's watched this show or followed our politics here at the Coalition for any length of time understands that a significant purpose of the effort behind this media is to be anti-war. What do I mean by anti-war? I mean anti-war. I mean anti-police action, anti-intrusion into the affairs of a sovereign nation, anti-guerrilla state, anti-capitalistic incursions into nations for the sole purpose of misappropriating their assets, anti-killing fields, anti-killing squads. We're anti-everything. Anyone who knows me on Facebook or follows me knows that my little icon there, or avatar, or whatever they're calling it this year, says, I'm already against the next war. And I'm opposed to the last 6 or 7, the ones that we, well, as I like to say, we drone the liberty into these people. I'm sure that the wedding parties that are under attack right now somewhere in the Middle East are grateful, for example, that it's now not Donald Trump leveling their cities and assassinating their families and leaders, but it's a new regime that's doing so, and it's doing it in a very politically correct manner. So obviously I'm sarcastic and sardonic about a deadly serious issue. You have to be after a while, because here we are in the year 2021, well, making the same mistakes, and I guess I'm being euphemistic there. They're not mistakes. Committing the same atrocities we are now as, well, we did some 60 years ago. Imagine that. We're moving in on the 60th anniversary, if you will, of our involvement in what later became the Vietnam War. And we're still doing the same stuff. So with that in mind, that I have taken the time as we've moved this into 5 nights of programming here to try to at least every week incorporate elements of what is a long-running, steadfast group of individuals across New England who have had the high moral fiber, the stick-to-itiveness, the fundamental decency amidst all the distractions of whether it be the 70s, 80s, 90s, now with in the midst of a pandemic, to stick to, if you will, their guns, and repeatedly and routinely and as a daily part of their life point out the atrocities that we as Americans are engaged in, that we perpetrate, that we perpetuate, and routinely support, even if it's just our tacit, everyday endorsement of the variety of regimes that have run our country for a few generations now. The names and the parties labels almost don't even matter to me anymore. It's this running tide of cruelty, destruction, and death that remain consistent throughout all the bad actors who have been, quote-unquote, our leaders, some elected, some self-appointed. So it is with great pride that I reintroduce to the audience some folks who I've just got to meet, and an individual who has been on this show before, so she officially now has repeat offender status, and ran, I believe, one of the really decent political campaigns of this generation. And of course, I'm talking about the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee. So I'm going to go down a few names. We're going to have a little bit of a rotating cast tonight. But first, I must introduce someone who is really spiritually one of the leaders of this effort, although this is clearly it's a cooperative effort amongst many people of many strengths. But the first person that comes to mind for many, because of her candidacy for the United States Senate just a few years ago, is of course Pat Fonce. And I have to say, Pat, welcome back to the Coalition. We're in a different place, in a different time, in a different space, but sadly, a lot of the issues that you and I discussed during your campaign for the United States Senate remain the same, don't they?
They do. They do, unfortunately. Yes. Situation has, if any, change got worse since that time. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, first of all, on a happy note, welcome back. It's good to see you again. It was great that we were able to chat for a little bit out in front of the Federal Building just a few weeks ago. I just from as people of conscience, if you will, for all of you, I have to applaud, and it's heartfelt, your continuing efforts to fight for peace at a time when I hate to say this, there's too many people who are just cynically dismissive of it. Joining us also on the line is Paul Hubbard and Tim Sprules. We want to get into your background in a little bit, but I just want to ask all three of you, if you were to give it a report card grade, and this is a grotesque oversimplification I'm asking you for, but if you were to give it a report card grade, what would you say is the status of the anti-war movement here in New England, the United States, and Rhode Island? Pat, what do you think?
Well, A for effort, but for effectiveness, obviously we're climbing up a steep hill. It's not an issue that many people are interested in devoting time to, but it's an important one, and it crosses boundaries between environmental groups and human rights groups, anti-poverty groups, religious people. So that's why we find this voice in our anti-war sentiment so important.
Tim, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and where your focus is.
Well, I've been a activist for human rights, and since my 20s, I worked at a socialist feminist bookstore collective in Providence for about 6 to 8 years. Then I finished my degree and went into teaching. I just retired this past summer as a public high school teacher. And, I first was active because just in general for human rights. And then, I started focusing on certain issues like nuclear weapons back in the 80s and the conflicts in the Middle East, particularly Palestinian rights. And, just basically because their story was so misrepresented in the United States. And then, I raised 2 girls, and that took my attention for about 20 years. And about 6-8 years ago, I started getting re-involved in activism and joined up with these folks that were veterans of the anti-war movement against the Iraq War. Times have changed, so we're not like in this dramatic invasion of Iraq and contemplating something like that. But this low-level warfare is immoral. I criticize, I blame the United States, my government, for most of the wrongdoing in the world. I mean, there's other countries that I can criticize, their governments, but that doesn't mean we have to attack the people of those countries, and that's essentially what we're doing. I'd like to let my colleagues speak a little bit, but one last point I want to make is that we're using sanctions now to punish a population of a country, to try to turn it against its own government, to overthrow it. I mean, that is just immoral, plain and simple. And the people of the world are not our enemies. The ruling classes of the various countries, yes, but each country's ruling class has to be dealt with by the people living there. And I want to deal with our government and do what I can to curtail its policies of aggression.
Thank you. Paul, welcome to the coalition. Paul Hubbard, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in the movement and where you like to focus your time.
Well, I feel simpatico to you because I actually go back to my youth when I got very involved in the huge movement that developed against the war on Vietnam, the U.S. war on Vietnam, which was a massive war crime. 3 million Vietnamese killed. Of course, the U.S. focuses on the 55,000 U.S. Soldiers who were killed, but and so basically, I sort of got my anti-war chops, my anti-war training during that time, and the U.S. never seems to not be at war somewhere, all the time. So it's just continued right up until today. I go back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1967 gave a famous, well-known speech at the Riverside Church in New York City called Beyond Vietnam. And one of my favorite quotes in it is, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." And he, in that speech, he really called it like it was, like it is. And that really hasn't changed. The U.S. uses economic warfare, uses cyber warfare, military warfare, diplomatic warfare. It's the only country in the world that has, 600-700 military bases spread out. It's the only country in the world that has nuclear armed submarines, aircraft carriers, battleships patrolling every ocean in the world. If the Chinese came here with a aircraft carrier off the coast of New York or down in the Gulf of Mexico, the U.S. would freak out. But the U.S. has 7 or 8 aircraft carriers in the South China Sea right now. There's just no comparison. If we want to stop war, we have to deal with the U.S. government.
What, to all of you, clearly the function of war has become evident to everyone as as a function of economics.
Absolutely.
We've got current situations now where we are almost imminent into a next stage engagement with Iran. We've already leveled Iraq. And then, of course, the one issue that has really brought together all the different vestiges and groups of the anti-war movement in a manner that I haven't really seen since the onset of the Iraqi war. And please, if I missed something, I want you to correct me at every level. But, of course, that's the situation in Yemen. And that's a significant part of your group's focus when you protest. Now, the first thing I have to ask this. Y'all don't just focus on protesting and arguing with people on social media, do? You old school protest, and when I say old school, you show up and you consistently show up and you consistently have a clear message, both to our federal delegation and to the population at large. How do you still do it? How do you show up all the time? I mean, is it the passion? Is it a moral? How do you do it? Pat, any one of you jump in, please.
Yes, well, I think it is. When you have a feeling that nothing you do is going to make any difference, you get down to the bare bones that you have to do it anyway. You're not doing it because you are sure that it's going to have an impact, but that because you are sure that you must do it to be true to the person that you are. We have been out on the sidewalk in front of the office of Senator Reid at the federal building in Providence for a long period of time now, every first Friday of the month from 5 to 6 o'clock with some changes in the wintertime. And We've been out there for time. It seemed as if it rained every first Friday of the month. If you needed crops irrigated, count on it. We were there in the rain. We were there in the cold when we had to start at 3:30 instead of 5 because it was black night by 5 o'clock. And
Right.
many times we asked each other that question: what are we doing here? Is it making any difference? It makes a difference to ourselves as well as to the public, who occasionally engage with us and with whom we occasionally engage in Kennedy Plaza. We're doing it because it needs to be done. We need to be able to stand up in front of the world and say, our government may be doing such and such, but here we are, we the people, who do not feel that way, who do not feel represented by our government, and we're being true to ourselves. These two gentlemen have talked about their long history, each one beginning earlier than the other. And I always go back to the fact that I began when I was 8 years old, and my oldest brother was killed in the Second World War. And I've been an anti-war campaigner ever since then, either on the sidewalks or in the classrooms. I remember in my Girl Scout troop, when we were accused, the Girl Scouts of America was accused by Senator McCarthy and the committee of, communist tendencies, because we had things called the World Citizenship Badge and a badge called International Friendship. And to move on from that on to, yes, my period of time in the convent when, in another form, one was acting for peace and praying for peace, and afterwards to the privileged time that I had of living in Europe for a very long time, which permitted me to come to a deep understanding of the view that other people in the world have of my country. It was while I was living in Ireland that I first discovered, that the date 9/11 meant a very different thing for people in Chile than it meant for Americans. And that it was associated with the CIA and with the death of Allende in Chile. So as the only American in many social and professional situations, I became extremely conscious of the need to stand up against what looks like to the outside world, a megalith, a unified block of aggression on the part of the United States.
I'd like to jump in if I could.
Yeah, please.
I do feel a moral sense of getting out there in the street once a month. But the other purpose is that, or one of the purposes is that we are trying to educate the public about U.S. foreign policy, because we're bombarded as a nation of there's enemies all over the world that we have to confront, that we're in danger. All this militarism, foreign policy is to protect Americans. So we're trying to show that that's not the truth. And, when you start out being anti-war, you think, okay, so why is the United States carrying out the foreign policy it does? So all of us have to go through some kind of investigation to try to understand what seems counter to common sense. Instead of cooperation and working with people around the world to share this planet, we're like trying to dominate it. What is all that about? And, you find that it's at the bottom is some very dark things that the rich seem to profit from war. I mean, they do. I shouldn't say they profit from war, that it's a big business. And that is what we're trying to point out to people, our fellow citizens, so that they can feel the confidence to say, look, let's seek another way. Let's not vote for these guys in Washington all the time that get their big campaign contributions from the defense contractors, and then the generals retire from the Army, Navy, and then become, contacts for the representatives for the military to buy more weapons. So that's what my main motivation is, and I'm trying to learn and educate others at the same time.
Our children, in terms of their education right now, in a very real sense, it seems like it's almost difficult to get them properly educated on the basics, if you will, the reading, the writing, the arithmetic. So it's almost and unheard of, I guess, to assume that there can be the real sort of deep dive into American history which would, for example, discuss Chile and Allende, to have a real conversation about what happened in Iran, not during the 70s when they occupied our consulate and obviously diverted dramatically from the American sphere of influence, but what happened, say, in the 50s when it is now acknowledged that the CIA engaged in a secret, not so secret war against what would pass significantly in the Middle East for a democratically elected government, which is ironically the reason why the Bush the Younger engaged, right? So we've got this neat 50-year turnaround where we destroyed some semblance of democracy and then tried to forcefully install some semblance of democracy. I guess it's a long-winded way of saying to all of you, do you think our children are getting any sort of education in Vietnam or any of the above?
Well, Tim, you've
that's
been in
hard
a
to
high
gauge.
school recently.
Let Paul
I would say
address this first.
that's hard to gauge. I mean, the internet has opened up everything so much. There's incredible anti-war documentaries and movies, on YouTube and stuff. And so if they're getting exposed. I think if the U.S. government tried another Iraq, like George Bush did in 2003, I think the people of this country would be against it. I think that there would be a revival of protests in the streets, and it's all sort of under the surface right now. I mean, after 20 years in Afghanistan, people, it just kind of goes into the background, I mean, the war in Yemen has actually sparked quite a bit of moral outrage on the part of not only the American people, but some people in Congress even. And of course, the U.S. has had this long-standing relationship with the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. is supplying all the weapons, all the planes. They're giving the Saudis intelligence on where to bomb in Yemen and all of this. And the people of Yemen are, on the verge of famine often. There's a blockade against, humanitarian relief for the people of Yemen. I mean, it's a bad situation. And, it's one of the reasons that it's one of our primary focuses right now is, we want the U.S. to stop, full stop, all support for the Saudi mission in Yemen and open up the blockade so that humanitarian relief can get into that beleaguered country. And we've also not expanded. This is something that's always been in the background with the anti-war group, but we're engaging more in the question of nuclear weapons. And just a few months ago, we had a very successful protest at the State House. We had over 200 people there. The primary focus of it was the signing of the banning all nuclear weapons treaty that's before the UN right now. And, trying to put pressure on our government to sign it. Of course, the U.S. will never sign something like that. But if they did, they wouldn't abide by it. The U.S. breaks international treaties and international law routinely. So, yeah, it's all of the above. It's a moral issue. It's a something that compels you to do this work. You feel compelled. And, we feel it's very worthwhile.
Let me run something by all of you. As someone who's myself engaged in practical politics as well, it strikes me that you have a unique confluence coming together. Traditionally, the peace movement, from my perspective, was tied into distinct historical events. But what's happening now is there's two, if you will, rivers of people engaging in the peace movement. And it's interesting to me because there are two very distinctive groups. On one hand, of course, you have the traditional left of center progressives who then those progressives that develop a conscience, as I like to tease, become involved in not just matters of economic domestically, but also look outward and see what's happening with the United States foreign policy, as well as other bad actors around the world. What's fascinating to me, of course, is, it's known to all of you, I'm a libertarian, and I'm active in the libertarian movement nationally. There is a second group of individuals coming forward, and many of these young men and women were actively engaged in any one of the Gulf War actions that have happened post 9/11. And they sought leadership under the gentleman, a congressman by the name of Ron Paul. And as Ron Paul has sort of, if you will, gone into retirement a bit, those folks have coalesced under the libertarian movement to become passionately anti-war. The libertarian movement was always anti-war, but it has I believe, morphed from a not a secondary issue, but not, we're typically associated with taxes and things like that, and some social cultural issues. But the single biggest, if you will, recruitment tool of the libertarian movement is this significant presence of veterans, men and women, who served overseas and have become virulently anti-war. And their education, in their case, was very often firsthand, because they were there on the killing fields of Iraq, and they saw firsthand. And some of them even were contractors after the war because they were so highly skilled in the art of war. And then they saw firsthand the other side. So these are people who have been from Fallujah to, well, everywhere. And so do you have hope in that the evolution of the Bernie, if you will, generation and the evolution of the Ron Paul generation, do you see those same seeds, if you will, those green shoots in the peace movement, and does that give you hope?
Well, I believe myself, it does give me hope. And one other thing I'd like to mention, that since you brought up veterans, is that I think it's a crime the way our government treats the veterans that have served in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, so many have come back with injuries, and then you hear that they're not given every service possible that they deserve after they consider themselves serving their country, and it's it's criminal, really, that these people have been used up and now forgotten about. Except for we're typically told, to say thank you for your service, but then we forget about them. And many of them, the suicide rate, for instance, is just one yardstick we can use to show the suicide rate amongst service people is just one yardstick to show how much damage those people have suffered from their involvement in the conflicts in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. So what?
Yes.
Go ahead, Pat. I'm sorry.
Well, to say nothing of the fact that, of course, the return of the bodies of those who don't make it back home is cloaked. No publicity giving to the landings at the Maryland airport where the coffins are brought. No publicity of the families going there to receive the bodies of their sons and daughters. So the impact, once the draft was abolished and you had an all-paid military, and then you cloak the deaths with no publicity when the bodies are returned, and you cloak the damage by not taking them into hospitals, not giving them all the service that they need. The impact of the war on the United States public is minimized.
Right.
People are not aware of the losses the way they were when the bodies were shown coming back from Vietnam. On the other hand, besides our rallying out on the street and protesting on the street corners, the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee also has a study group. And in that study group, recently we read a book by Danny Haifong, who was a young veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So yes, that book was written by two young veterans. And there's another instructor at West Point, who was an instructor at West Point. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, S.J. Jerson. And so there is that young element coming along, but there still is a great need in Rhode Island, at least, to unite the young people who are, for instance, very active in the Sunrise Movement, very concerned about climate, but who don't yet seem to be picking up that the biggest threat to the climate, the biggest polluter on the planet is the United States military. And I think that one of the things we are trying to work at, not only in the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee, but in other peace groups to which I belong, is trying to get these young people to realize the tie between their climate activism and also their social justice activism, because the story about poverty and the story about unemployment all has to do with the fact that money isn't being devoted to human needs, but is being devoted to expanding the military.
And would you argue still that a great deal of the recruitment in the United States military is aimed at parts of the country and segments of our population, both ethnic and racial, which presents a role in the military as an economic investment? How do you folks feel about that?
That was definitely true when they were ramping up for the George W. Bush war on Iraq 2003, through that whole 3-4 year period there, say 2003 to 2007. We used to call it the poverty draft because they were just vacuuming up lots and lots of, innocent, naive young people. And they were offering decent wages, decent benefits, and if you survived, you might be able to get money for a college education at the end. There was definitely that aspect of it, for sure.
Now, I know, Pat, you've got to go in a little bit, and we've got our two other guests that we want to bring online in just a couple minutes. I guess the open question for the evening, and this is something that probably bears much conversation, particularly folks like you who are stakeholders in the peace movement and have invested literally a lifetime into it, is how do we get in a state where one of our United States senators is really purported to be a shadow Secretary of Defense, a graduate of the United States Military Academy, and despite self-identifying as a progressive Democrat, has done nothing to limit the expansion of our overseas, our overseas just reign of terror. How do we mobilize these young people? How do we get them off the keyboards, out of the the comfort zone? And so, by the way, that there are so many people. I was at the protest this past weekend at Kennedy Plaza over mass transportation. The efforts to rename Kennedy Plaza Paolino Plaza, as I put it. So there are clearly a lot of people invested in it heavily, but on a larger scale, I guess, how do we foment that type of both education and unrest to give our senators and our congressional delegation a little bit of a comeuppance?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, I think. I'm sorry, Paul, but
about Senator Reid, right?
Oh yeah, good old Jack.
Yeah, I almost prefer him to someone like Sheldon Whitehouse, who's a hypocrite, a total hypocrite in my view, especially on military foreign policy. He got elected as part of the anti-war, the 2006 anti-war Democratic wave. And he's become a complete and total pro-war, pro-military senator. Reid always was that out front. So it's almost, I mean, I don't agree with him. I don't want him to be, to be reelected, but it's almost refreshing that he was that honest and out front. So,
but Pat, to answer your question about how do we mobilize the young people, I think that's the big question that we always wrestle with, and that's one of the reasons why we're out on the street corner once a month, because we're trying to be visible. We're trying to motivate others to join us. I mean, that would be the ideal situation. So we're pressing the fight against militarism on any front that we can deal with, in the street, in educational programs, using the media to reach out to people. We're trying to build a movement. It's very difficult, but we started the show by saying that we consider this our moral imperative, and we're just going to keep trying, and you never know what's going to happen. So,
and Pat, as you'll see in the next half of the program, the fruit of our endeavors is at least shown in the adhesion of Enrique Sanchez to our group. He's a new young person whom we recruited at the bus stops in Kennedy Plaza, and he's stuck with us several months now, is active in our group, and he'll be speaking for himself. Perhaps he can address the question of youth, because it's his own age category that he'll be representing.
Excellent. So I think at this moment, and by the way, this is the first in a multi-stage conversation. The beauty of this format, folks, is that there's no 3-minute soundbite here. There's no beginning or end to the conversation. We've got a couple of shows on our network which are almost on a weekly or bi-weekly or a monthly basis meeting up to continue a conversation. So I hope what we're doing tonight is really just laying the groundwork, if you will, because there are no silver bullets in this. There are no quick fixes. The movie doesn't end at 90 minutes with a happy resolution. This has taken generations to place us in this position, and it, this and I can say this with a smile amongst all of us. This resolution may outlast us, if you will. But I think, Pat, do you need to sign off now? And we're going to bring on two other folks. So who's staying and who's going? Okay. So, folks, thank you for joining us. And again, I'm serious about this. I'd like us to get together every few weeks or when events dictate and continue this conversation and use this as a public forum for which I hope we can build, provide as one of many ways to educate the public as events dictate, because the Yemeni situation is not going away anytime soon. And
thank you very much. We'll be back whenever you want us.
Yeah. Extend our invitation to us.
All
Thanks very much.
All right. Absolutely. So we're doing a little bit of transition here now. Coming online is Enrique. Doing a little bit of a handoff here.
Yep. Hey, how are you doing, Pat?
Good. The digital age. We're playing with the name cards and everything else like that. And then, John, who else do we have coming on? And Glenn. Okay. So everybody hang tight. Folks, if you're just joining us right now, the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee is meeting with us. And we're kind of moving some folks in and out to just touch on a whole lot of issues. Again, the focus here is to build a foundation for an ongoing conversation about the anti-war movement and to educate, inform, connect, and quite frankly, start to build a base where we can issue a humanitarian challenge to those that would represent us, and as I like to say, sometimes self-appointed, sometimes elected, for this. It's astonishing. Let's see who's with us. Paul is still with us, right?
Yeah.
Paul, let me run this by you. How is it that, years after the Powell doctrine, and of course the Powell doctrine was created after the Vietnam War, so for the purpose of not engaging in actions, military actions, where there would be this mission creep, that there had to be a clear and present danger to the United States. There had to be a well-articulated reason to engage in combat. There had to be an exit strategy, and it had to be, explained, if you will, and justified. And, then there, of course, there's that crazy War Powers Act thing. I think that's still out there somewhere. So the Powell Doctrine was supposed to, in effect, avoid situations like the 200-year war in Afghanistan, or our quote-unquote, air quotes, support of the Saudis in their genocidal attacks on Yemen. How do we get to this point? What happened to the Powell Doctrine?
I just, first, I want to say hi to my friends, Glenn and Enrique.
Hey.
Welcome them to the show. And, that is such a great question. I've thought about that myself. I think that whole Powell Doctrine was trying to put some guardrails on the U.S. war machine and the U.S. propensity for war in response to what had happened in Vietnam, the first major defeat of the U.S. military, and by a very poor, very under-resourced country, fighting for their independence, literally. And it was a shock. It was a shock to the U.S. rulers. It was a big shock to the U.S. public. Of course, it was partly the U.S. public that forced the war machine out of Vietnam. But that's what I think that Powell Doctrine was, and I think it fell by the wayside. It was so easily brushed aside. You had Reagan coming in. He had a couple of wars in Latin America. We had the first Bush. He had a couple, Grenada, I believe. The U.S. Congress actually tried to put some very strict controls through their power of the purse on the use of military force. And of course, Reagan just illegally, with the whole Iran-Contra scandal, funded, what was an illegal war against the Sandinistas in the 80s. If they want to go to war, they're going to find a way. And it's up to us, the people of the U.S. and internationally, to put the brakes on that.
We've got a couple of new guests joining us. Let's have each of them introduce themselves. Enrique Sanchez, why don't you tell us about yourself, how you got involved in the anti-war movement, and what is your focus, and what's motivating you?
Yeah. Beforehand, thank you so much, Pat, for hosting the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee tonight. Thank you to my good friends and here at the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee for having me on and letting me be part of this discussion. My name is Enrique Sanchez. I'm a native Rhode Islander with a Mexican-American background. My family's been in the state for 30 plus years now. Opened up some of the first Mexican small businesses, restaurants in Providence, in Rhode Island. And I am currently a educator, a Providence substitute public school teacher at JSEC in the South Side, and I am also a local activist and advocate in the community. I am involved with the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee because Like I was listening earlier to my friends mention how we have to also bring about, more consciousness around the anti-war movement, around foreign policy, around connecting militarism, not just in our country but abroad, right? I think understanding foreign policy and understanding our aggressive foreign policy that our government carries out is something that many people on the right and many people on the left can come together and show some bipartisanship. Personally, I have read, I have studied war and conflict across all history, not just our government and our country, but every other country's government and history. I have family who served in the Marines, who served in the Army, who served in the National Guard, family members and friends close to me. And my focus, as a young 24-year-old male, is to bring more consciousness about the war movement, about the anti-war movement, and militarism, and our war crimes committed abroad by our elected officials, and our bring more of that awareness to our young people, because like we mentioned earlier, there's the Sunrise Movement, the Medicare for All movement, the environmental stuff, the policy initiatives in our country, but there is not a lot of focus on the anti-war movement and calling out our aggressive foreign policy that is carried abroad.
We've got Glenn Bennett here. Glenn, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and where your focus is and what motivates you as well. Oh, do we not have Glenn's voice? Oh, we're having a little trouble hearing Glenn. All right, so we'll figure that out in the background. That's sort of the joys of this technology. Gentlemen, let me throw this out to the crowd, if you will. When I ask questions like this, I want to make it clear that your organization and a handful of others in the state have done everything humanly possible to educate people on the tragedies, the genocide, the loss of humanity, if you will, with all these issues. So when I ask these questions, it's not to diminish any one of your efforts, but I think we can all agree. And listen, I've tried as well. What do you think the average Rhode Islander, what if any recognition do they have of the humanitarian nightmare in Yemen is? And just feel free to jump in.
Go ahead, Enrique.
Okay. Yeah. I think a very small percentage of our population understands the atrocities and the current genocide that is happening as we speak in Yemen. Now, I always been a person, right, that we have to be very critical of every aggressive foreign policy, not just committed by our government, but committed by other governments abroad. I think that's what in general we have to be conscious about. But our government, both Republicans and Democrats, have accelerated that focus on the atrocities committed by the what would you call it, the Saudi support for the atrocities committed in Yemen. Now, that being, we understand that the Saudi Arabian government regime is a big ally to our government, but we have to understand that supporting Saudi Arabia, supporting by sending them weapons every year, supporting by sending them money that comes out of our financial budget each year, giving them billions of dollars each year, accelerates that that genocide that is currently happening in Yemen, because we may not be there on the boots physically, but we are accelerating that situation by funding that war currently happening in Yemen. And our population needs to wake up and realize that, and we need to call it out as it is.
How do we do that?
Hey, Pat,
Yeah, go ahead. Please jump in.
I have to say goodnight. I want to leave you in the very capable hands of my friends, Enrique and Glenn. And I want to thank you 100 times for having us on. And anytime you invite us back, we will be here. I had a great time, and I think Pat and Tim did as well. So I want to thank you and say goodnight.
All right, good night, buddy. And we will. Like I said, this is just the start. We're gonna do everything we can to cover live whatever street actions you guys have, your or whatever activities you have, and promote them to the general public. Because I think all of us need to work together on this. I know we're having a little bit of trouble. No, thank you, buddy. I know we're having a little bit of trouble with Glenn. So Enrique, as the youngest person of the cast of characters tonight, the circles that you travel in. Now, you're an activist. If you were to ask your activist friends what sort of, they've only got so much time. Particularly people in your age group are finding themselves having to work multiple jobs. It's a challenge. I have kids your age, to put it in relief. What of their activism life? How much? What is there a rough percentage that folks are willing to put towards things like foreign policy and the anti-war movement, or do you feel like so much of the focus is based on domestic issues just because of the sheer need?
Well, yeah, I would say definitely that our younger population in this country focuses way more on domestic issues happening, but that's the thing, right? I mean, what we go through here in this country is also very interconnected with what our government does abroad, and we have to, as young people, and not just young people, right? Everyone in general, but the younger population, we call ourselves activists, we call ourselves, community organizers, fighting for advocacy, younger leaders, but we make a grave error by not taking into consideration foreign policy and pushing for the anti-war movement support. That is something that is still pretty well not called out, and I'm just doing my part. I talk to other younger activists, other folks in the activist community, and I try to convince folks, but that just makes me realize, makes me think how much energy and time we're willing to invest in pushing for the anti-war movement and also calling out our foreign policy. But yeah, I could say, Pat, it is a very small percentage of folks in our age group that has supported the anti-war movement for
right. And as part, again, there are so many challenges here locally in Rhode Island. Criminal justice reform, which seems to be going nowhere despite incredible Herculean efforts by people. There is, there are all sorts of economic issues, both before and as a result of the pandemic. Again, folks here are just trying to get by. I always say there's a whole lot of us on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It's difficult sometimes to get folks to have the energy, if you will, or have the space to consider what's going on a few thousand miles away in a country that they'll never see. Within the folks that you are activists with, though, are they curious? Is there a way to breach the conversation? Broach the conversation, I should say. What would you do if you could get support to take it more to the streets to get people energized? What do you think needs to happen?
I think what needs to happen is is we have to start from ground up, from do a massive rooted grassroots campaign to bring more of the anti-war movement and foreign policy into place. We have to call out what's happening in Latin America, right? What's happening in Asia and the Middle East, and then Eastern Europe and Africa as well. And there are just so many things happening, right? It's like I tell some of my activist friends and community organizers, hey, we have 150 plus military bases across the globe, and not every and not all of those 150 bases, have our permission to be there, and it's just like, yeah, well, I mean, I don't know, what can we do? Well, what can we do is, I mean, if we're talking about defunding the police here in this country, right? Because that's the big topic right now. We also have. I feel like the most effective thing would be to defund the military. I mean, more money is invested in our military than in the police and the
Right.
policing in the country. I mean, I understand defunding the police and all of that is a very sensitive topic for a lot of folks. It's very controversial, but for me personally, I think we can bring more funds, more support for our people in this country, right? Invest more in our communities. It doesn't matter if it's in biracial communities and white communities and LGBTQ plus communities, whatever the case is. I think if we take away money from militarism and from the military industrial complex, then I think both the left and the rights can come to some consensus, and agree on more things, because I do think we do need policing in this country, right? But I don't think we need a very powerful and very well funded military industrial complex where a bunch of military contractors and private corporate donors and corporate people are living off the misery of working Rhode Islanders and working Americans. So that's the kind of topic those are the kind of discussions that I'm trying to have with the activist community, with the people that we're involved with in the streets. But that's just my opinion, and that's just my my perspective on things.
Yeah, no, it's an important one again because listen, all of us are at a certain age. A lot of us are from the Vietnam War era on into the early stages, if you will, of what has become seemingly a lifelong Middle East crisis. And we see the impact of it over and over again. Bad policy decisions made in the early 20th century, now, as we go into we're well into the 21st century, are still bearing fruit. How do we avoid making those same mistakes? We've got a president of the United States who was elected, in part, I wouldn't even argue that this was a significant, vote getter per se, but he made it clear that he was going to stop funding the Saudi, if you will, genocide on Yemen. And yet, all we've gotten so far is a milquetoast-like quote about not, only supporting defensive weapons. Well, I mean, okay. How does that work on a field of battle? You're going to tell me that the Saudis are going to just keep in the background American missiles, just in case? Break glass when necessary. You can't get them unless you got the right thumbprint, like your iPhone. Again, people hide behind words. Our leadership here in the state of Rhode Island does it. Our federal delegation does it. How vested are folks? And I hate to put you on the spot like this, but this is valuable input. Your generation locally is heavily vested into local politics, and God bless them for that. And that type of energy is critical. Do you get that same involvement with our federal delegation? I mean, are many folks in your generation, do they care about a Jack Reed or a David Cicilline or a Jim Langevin or who's that other guy, White House, whatever the hell his name is? Is there that kind of emotional connection as they say to a Tiara Mack or someone like that?
I want to answer a couple questions that you had here. Let's just clear this up. Let's get this out of the way. The same foreign policy under Trump and Obama and Bush and Clinton and Reagan and their predecessors is the same foreign policy that Joe Biden is committing. Let's just get that out
Yep.
of the table, right? Democrats and Republicans
Don't matter.
have the same foreign policy initiatives, the same foreign policy agenda. They're both warmongering parties. Sometimes I feel like the Democrats are more hawkish than the Republicans, and sometimes I feel like the Republicans are more hawkish than the Democrats. But that's just how every scenario plays out. Our federal delegation, I would say all four of them are in a civil society. In a civil society, would be considered war criminals. But that's just me. And why do I say that? Because all four of them have both voted for more of war aggressive foreign policy, military foreign policy across the globe. White House, I would say Jack Reed, because he's in that position of power as chair of the War and Finance Committee in D.C. Jack Reed, White House, Langevin, and Cicilline, both support down the aisle with Republicans when it comes to bipartisanship support for more military funding. And you're right. There isn't that vocal support or vocal criticism for our federal delegation as there is for other elected officials who are more invested in local politics, and I think that's a very grave danger there that we don't take into consideration, or we don't criticize our federal delegation as often as we do with the local politicians, because the federal delegation, right, reports back from Washington D.C. They are in charge of our budgets here in the state. They're in charge of the decisions that come out of Rhode Island to D.C. and are implemented across the country. They represent Rhode Islanders. And every day I'm starting to think that they don't represent every single Rhode Islander in their best interests. They represent, war profiteers, corporate donors, supporters, the top 1%, the wealthy, the elites, and that, to me, we have to call that out as the younger activists, and that's something that I'm trying to push for. I had a conversation with Jack Reed the other day. He went to an event in solidarity with the Asian American community when all that was happening with the violence that was being committed against our Asian American community. He was there, and I asked him about that bill that came into at the General Assembly about divesting from the war machine to invest in a Green New Deal and environmental justice. And him and his talking points about we have enemies across the globe, we have grave danger happening, and I told the senator, Senator, we have 150 military bases across the globe. We have nuclear weapons based, out of our country and other countries as well. I think we're set. As far as I know, I don't think Russia nor China yet have the military capacity to invade us or to hurt some of our neighbors across the globe. And him and his talking points, and it's the same talking points that come from DC and back to Rhode Island and vice versa. And I think we have to do a better job at criticizing our federal delegation, because they're continuing the same pattern of investing in more of a war economy.
Excellent. Hey, I think we managed to connect with Glenn. Glenn, welcome. Hey, ain't technology great?
You had a great opportunity to listen to the good thoughts of our friend Enrique, which is important. A reboot seems to have solved the problem, but anyhow, you asked, I think, how I came around to be involved with the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee, or the whole concept of anti-war activism, and I'd like to talk about that. I think the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee is a really important function. If I remember right, they played a little role, or some role, in combating or opposing, it'd be a bad choice of words, the cluster bombs that Textron used to make a number of years ago, which I believe have been discontinued. But, you know, it wasn't just RIAC that brought that about, but they certainly supported that effort, and that's important. And I think maybe that's what brought them to my attention. Maybe a year or two ago, I started showing up at their monthly vigils, which are important. You know, we'd love to have 20, 50 people standing there. Someday we probably will. But it's important to have that kind of commitment to the mission of a peaceful world. I like to say this is the 21st century, and we know stuff. You know, we know history. So being a boomer, me, as a baby boomer,
Yep.
I've lived through that period since the end of World War II, right? And my father was drafted in 1942, and he served in the Army as a combat infantryman, but also as an engineer of some sort. Anyhow, he served in Europe for a few years, ended up in Germany as an occupying force, like that. So I have a little bit of that knowledge from him. He didn't like talking about it much. We can go into that some other time. But so anyhow, a lot of people think of World War II as the last good war, maybe even, you know, a good war. But I'm not going to pass judgment on that war. But I will observe that World War I failed in its mission to be the war that ended all wars. So when World War II came around, maybe it was a necessary war. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But since then, the Korean, you know, misadventure, the Southeast Asian, Vietnamese military adventurism, it involved Cambodia and Thailand completely illegally. It was never declared war. The horrific stuff that went on there. I came of age, you might say, I turned 18 in 1971, and there was still a draft. If I go on too long, please feel free to stop me. But
No, this is important.
So the draft, I graduated from high school, I was 18, and I was vulnerable to the draft. I was already opposed to the Vietnam War, but I took the position with the draft. What I registered for the selective service, which, you know, still exists, and I told him, I'm a conscientious objector, I'm not going, you know. And then, so I went through the process. It didn't exactly work out the way you might think, but I didn't end up getting drafted, and I didn't end up serving in the military. And then the lottery for the draft came around, you know. So if you were lucky enough to have a number higher than 113 or something like that, you weren't likely to get drafted. So that played a factor too. But I was always opposed to the war because I wasn't going to travel 10,000 miles and try to interfere in the internal affairs of another country and do harm to, I'm sure there's a lot of intricacies and advanced aspects of Vietnam, but there was a lot of rice farmers, and they weren't my enemy. I think
Right.
Muhammad Ali had something to say about that at the time too. So anyhow, the point I want to make is that this is the 21st century, and we can't even afford to even entertain the idea of all-out war. You know, there's a little bit of noise, you might say, now about the possibility of World War III with China, because that's what it would amount to. You're not going to have a little skirmish with China. That's probably going to escalate very quickly if they have the first hot exchange over there in the South China Sea. So those are some thoughts I have on that. So maybe we can.
What from your perspective, you know, we've been talking a lot about education tonight. How do we get more people out on those Friday vigils? How do we, you know, with everything that's going on in the world right now? And you know, I spent some quality time in the with our governor this afternoon at the weekly press conference held, and the COVID crisis, at least here in Rhode Island, goes on unabated. A whole segment of the population is trying to figure out how to hold on to whatever financially they've got left. You've got criminal justice issues, which are in the forefront of every social activist that I know's mind, because it's very real here in Rhode Island. The problems are very real, despite what the conventional media would have you believe. They're still peddling the one bad apple don't spoil the whole bunch girl. Was that I'll ask my producer here, wasn't that Michael Jackson in the Jackson 5? So, you know, you've got all this nonsense and chaos going on. How the hell do we make real for people a humanitarian crisis that's going on seemingly in a different part of the world, seemingly almost in a different century.
I wanted to address that maybe this way, and I meant to say it earlier. You were kind enough to attend our peace vigil at the beginning of April. It happened to be Good Friday. And you made the observation that Good Friday is perhaps one of the more significant days that should be for the observance of peace than most other days, right?
Right.
And I don't think that our organized religions are doing their job. So you're talking about getting more people out. How is it that preachers of whatever stripe aren't standing in their pulpit saying, your job one, people, is to get out there and tell our government to stop spending so much money killing people?
That's a damn good point. Yikes. You know, it's pretty easy to, and I know a bunch of ministers. I actually took at least part of the United Methodist Church's lay speaking course, and probably one of the only times in my life when I've been at a loss for words. As you guys get to know me, you'll understand the humor there. But you're right. We had the Catholic Church in at least during the height of this the Civil War era and the and particularly at the height of the anti-war, you had significant parts of the Catholic Church which they'd enabled the ministry to become provocatively involved, and particularly a handful of, if you will, portions of the priesthood, to the point where they almost got too involved. Yet it would appear that this Pope is much more of a fundamentalist in terms of both economics and social issues. Has there been, from your perspective, during your time with the committee, has there been any active presence from the ministry at all?
If you're asking me that, no, I have.
Either or.
Enrique, do you have some?
I was going to make it short. From my time, within the short time that I've been involved with the Rhode Island Anti-War Committee, I have not seen much significant support and presence from our religious affiliation groups throughout the state. I mean, other than that's it for me. Glenn, what do you think? What do you know?
I didn't catch that last bit, but not to dwell anymore on the religious aspect of it. That's just a piece of it. You mentioned earlier, you're talking about, getting the youth interested. Unfortunately, and I think this came up earlier too, that a military career is an economic engine or a career path. And when we created the volunteer army, I heard the term used back in one of the presidential elections, a warrior class, and I was appalled. But there may be some truth to it, that's what actually does exist. How is it that here in Rhode Island in the 21st century, we have something called a war college? That's just remarkably unrealistic, unreasonable. We don't need a war college.
Well, I mean, if you remember it, I'm actually just taking a quick look right now. There was, down in Fort Benning, and I'm trying to remember the name of it right now. There was a University of the Americas or whatever, which was essentially a training base for, you have your future farmers and of America, right? So this was sort of the training base for the future tin pot dictators of America. And I think they ended up engaging in a rebranding about 15 or 20 years ago because of the, and let's be blunt too, there was a significant Saudi Arabian presence in those training efforts because there was an attempt to bring the Saudi Air Force up to the standards, if you will, of the Israeli Air Force. And, I wonder, I think, Mr. Bennett, you and I are old enough to remember that that cartoon where I've said, I think it's I have seen the enemy and he is us. I think that was Pogo. back in the day. There's a significant element of that that's still at play. So it strikes me that our foreign policy is intertwined with our drug policy, which is effectively intertwined with our notion of social justice, which all ultimately impacts, if you will, the criminal justice system in America, because you've got, cities like Ferguson, Missouri, turning into weaponized camps. Right now, posted outside of ironically, the injection site at the Dunkin' Donuts Center, and who, by the way, every person that I met over there was wonderful, including members of the National Guard. But you do have a military presence outside of if you will, a vaccination center. And you had a strong military presence, if you will, at the peaceful demonstrations that took place in the wake of the civil rights murders last year. And the one night of violence that was originally accorded to the said members of the local civil rights community turned out to be out-of-town white guys in a moment of not-so-subtleity. So I guess my thought is for tonight, before we sign off, to just sort of come to an understanding that maybe that's the connections that we all have to try to make within our respective spheres of influence. And Enrique, your presence here tonight is certainly heartening. That there's perhaps the next time we get together, discuss that sort of interrelationship between civil liberties, the criminal justice system, our military system, and our foreign policy, because they're all, in my mind, intimately related. And I just wonder, before we close off, what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, no, I mean, you just hit the spot with that. Our activist community in this country, our people who are protesting, right? The BLM movement, the LGBTQ plus movement, the environmental stuff, the Green New Deal, all of this is great, and I support that, and I'm always out there with them, right? All the movement in general. But you're right, we miss the spot with the war on drugs stuff, not just in this country but across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
We miss it with the militarism and the foreign policy across the globe, and then we just fast forward and we skip those two steps, and we go straight forward to the justice system and the criminal justice system and the social justice system.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a mistake, that the activist community in this country is making, because we have to be able to connect all the dots,
right.
And if we don't connect all of those 4 or 5 things, and have them intertwined, then no real progress is being made. There is no real progress being made. We have to be considerate, and this is my issue, my problem with Democrats, right, and Republicans, but mostly Democrats, because right, the Democrats are supposedly the ones who are fighting for everyone and this and that, but we're seeing before our eyes, right, what is happening under the Biden administration. We are seeing a very transparent, very diverse, very a very diverse coalition of all people of backgrounds, from Black and brown to LGBT plus to more females, more people, more women of color under the Biden administration. But we are still seeing that same aggressive foreign policy being committed abroad. So it's like we care about, it's like we have to supposedly care about Black and brown people and people of color in this country. But what about the people of color? What about the people of color across the globe? Right? What about the Black and brown people across the globe, and the working people and the poor people across the globe? Why are we so focused on our stuff, on trying to bring social justice to this country, when a diverse coalition of people under Biden are committing those same injustices and atrocities abroad? And that is the mistake that we make as citizens of this country, not taking into consideration the well-being of other people across the globe. And that's what I want to keep fighting for, to make sure that everyone has a voice. Those are my final thoughts. To bring more awareness to the war movement here in Rhode Island, I would say, do a massive campaign of online, promotion, outreach to folks, and that's what I'm working on, trying to build up social media outlets to try to have folks come out to our vigils and events and protests.
Excellent. Glenn, why don't you give us a final thought, since we
Thanks,
couldn't get you into the last minute.
So, have you noticed, and I'm pretty sure you have, that the two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, outcompete each other trying to spend more and more dollars on weapons and war and bases and the military, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no alternative amongst those two. It's you can have war and weapons, or you can have more war and more weapons. And it's at any given moment, it's either of them that's willing to step it up further. What's like 50% of our discretionary budget is spent on weapons and war. So there are alternatives. And in 2016, and it's important that I offer an alternative. I can't just come here and point fingers and say, oh, this is bad and that's bad. So in 2016, I was the campaign manager for Jill Stein of the Green Party and her running mate, Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu Baraka, a friend of mine, is an active principal person in the Black Alliance for Peace. And perhaps this kind of brings together the concept of minorities and the struggles that they have with racism and justice and rights and so forth, with the overall concept of the war. Like, I talk a lot about the Vietnam War, which I know is a long time ago, but way too many minorities, people of color, were amongst the dead and injured in the Vietnam War. Nobody should have been there, but it was like handed over to them to do the dirty work, you might say. So
Absolutely.
Ajamu Baraka, Black Alliance for Peace, he does good work. Now, I would suggest that a third political party, maybe the Libertarians, I'm a little more inclined to say the Green Party, can bring to the table an alternative, which is, let's reduce military spending. Let's cut the number of military bases. Now, when we do that, let's be sensitive to the fact that everyday people whose jobs are intertwined with the production of weapons and the maintaining of the military, they have to be protected, their interests, their economic. So we have to find an alternative. And the alternatives do exist. And I get a little radical here. And by that, I mean, if you look to the Apollo program, when they decided to have a space race to see who could put people in orbit, even on the moon, they created 400,000 jobs doing that, right? And it wasn't in the business of making weapons. It's more involved in that, but it's just an example I would offer to you, that there are alternatives to making bombs that would keep people employed in good jobs.
Right. Full disclosure, you may not be aware of this. I don't know if you caught the beginning of the show. I'm the chairman of the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island. And I was the campaign chair for Joe Jorgensen in 2020, as well as I did regional media for New England for the Joe Jorgensen campaign. So it's, we are absolutists when it comes to ending wars. There's, in our statement of principles, our campaign platform, there's absolutely no question that we look for an immediate withdrawal from our troops around the globe, and and a sophisticated, purely defensive posture for our armed forces. We're quite frankly, we're absolutists about it, and and I would point to one of the biggest areas of growth in the peace movement, the anti-war movement, are the Scott Hortons of the world, and the anti-war people.me, that a lot of whom are libertarian based and have a passion for ending war. And it's interesting because there are so many young libertarians that, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, are military veterans, young men and women. So it's we wear that on our sleeves. It's part of our DNA. We see all of this behavior as reprehensible, and we will brook no excuses as to why most of it can't end, tomorrow. If Joe Biden, to Enrique's point, if Joe Biden tomorrow wants to end arms sales to the Saudis, he can. And he has shown.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, the reason I say that is, haven't we seen an example when, like, even now, I don't particularly care for Mr. Trump, but he did talk about pulling out of Afghanistan. And what happened? The Democratic senators and congressmen coalesced around opposition to the idea of reducing a military operation.
Absolutely. No, and again, you look to the institutions from which generates our politicians, and you will see, listen, all you have to do is have a base closing commission and watch, what's that song, True Colors? You see the true colors. Right now, I don't think any of us would be shocked at the reaction by Mr. Whitehouse or Mr. Reid, but there are states that have significant military presences who have left of center or alleged, and just like Democrats often pretend to be the party of peace, you have folks who are willing to, if you will, be controlled opposition. And then you have in the Republican Party, you have people who call themselves libertarian leaning, which is kind of bizarre because it's, I can diffuse that pretty quickly. I go to one of these liberty leaning people and I say, "Do you believe in borders?" And they're like, "Well, yes, of course." Okay, you're not a libertarian. Sorry, you're a nice person, but don't try to co-opt my movement. Don't try and this libertarian leaning bullshit. Excuse my language. Is just that. It's utter crap. And there are people in the Democratic movement who claim to be, the party of peace, and then you get the buts, right, on both sides. You get the but, and again, no profiles of courage are to be found in either of those two parties, for the most part. There are individual examples, but and I'll point out in California, you have a congressman there. And I'm just searching for some reason. I always have a blank. Ro Khanna is who I'm thinking about. Obviously, he is a gentleman who is willing to stand right in front. Despite being a United States congressman. So, and even though he's not a libertarian, he's a Democrat. And has been in Congress for just a few sessions, but his willingness to get out in front of this, I think, is heroic. There are profiles of courage out there. I can't paint with a broad brush, but they're few and far between when push comes to shove. Then again, remember, Rhode Island has a United States Senator, Sheldon Whitehouse, who loved to virtue signal and get on the floor of the House every day and preach about the environment, yet would not oppose the frack gas power plant Invenergy was looking to put in Burrillville, which is astonishing to me that he wasn't called out more in the media for that.
Right.
He would never come out against it, despite the fact that the people of Burrillville wanted nothing to do with it, and it was diametrically opposed to literally everything he pretended to stand for. So there is no shortage of hypocrisy right now in the movement. But I'll make this invitation to you. The gentleman you were speaking of, the vice presidential candidate, if somehow you can at some time get him to give us a half hour or 45 minutes or an hour of his time, we'd love to have him on the air. My dream is to somehow get Representative Khanna on these airwaves at some time in the next year or so, understanding that the guy is, pulled in 1,000 different directions, but we need to elevate the conversation here in Rhode Island. That's probably a big part of the challenge. And I'll never, listen, that's not a comment on your organization's efforts whatsoever. You guys have been steadfast and out front for years. You haven't wilted a single bit, despite the fact that surrounding you is a body politic that is not so committed. None of this
Pat,
is a fault of your efforts.
Question for you.
Sure.
Pat, I do have a question for you. Both, just to confirm, but both Ron Paul and Rand Paul are both libertarian, right? Republican, libertarian.
They're both at one point in time. Ron Paul was a libertarian. Both are Republicans. Both have no connection to the Libertarian Party at all. Rand Paul is often cited by the conventional media, who is fairly ignorant of just about everything, as being the on the forefront of a libertarian wave. And Ron Paul is a libertarian hero. Rand Paul is just a pale, weak imitation of his father. None of the creds, none of the belief. I mean, you know, and his fate, as far as we were concerned, was sealed the day he got up in a stadium and literally embraced Donald Trump, figuratively, politically, literally. And I have no use for the guy. He's part of a cult of personality that exists in the Republican movement who desperately needs to hero worship someone, and we saw where that got them, right? Yeah, yikes.
All I was going to say this is my last comment. Honestly, you know, regardless of people's criticism or support for Ron Paul, you know, Ron Paul has been, you know, or was, right, one of the lead vocal critics of the war movement, of calling out our aggressive policy. And you know, I mean, I'd take a Ron Paul over a Reid or a Whitehouse or a Sicily or Langdon, you know, when it comes to policy.
Yeah, Ron Paul, absolutely. Ron Paul is a national treasure. Rand Paul, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I guess if you're a Republican, you still worship, you know, I think all these guys still have their pictures of Ronnie Reagan, spelled RONNYRAYGUN, right? Ronnie Reagan, up in there, you know, and then you look at Mike Reagan, his son. Oof. So, you know, the Rand Paul, yeah. But gentlemen, again, thanks for sticking with us. This turned into sort of like almost like a late night college bowl session, if you will, and that was a lot of fun. But you know, this, like I said, this is the beginning. Let's build on this. Let's generate creative ideas for programming and conversation, and see how far we can take it. Right? Fair enough.
Thanks for having me.
Very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great.
All right.
Keep up the good work.
We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. Folks, feel free, please, take a moment if you're hearing this for the first time and you're wondering what kind of media hosts third rail issues and spends hours talking about policy and anti-war movements and things like that. The one way you can support us is to simply like us and share us on social media. It's so critical to us that we use these tools to elevate these conversations above the noise generated by the conventional media, the conventional Me Too media, the conventional press release media, the conventional I'm going to report on somebody else's report, which is a condensation of someone else's report media. We need your help there. So like us, share us, all that good stuff. Folks, we will be back on the air tomorrow night. We'll see you soon. Have a great